My Figma files are pretty organized just because that's the way that my brain tends to work.
Every single page that you have, I want to get to the bottom of it. I want to figure out like what's going on there because it's such a well thought out process.
I use that to understand what that problem is, and based on that, talk about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and then what our goal is with this, just so that anybody who's coming on here, they can just see that.
So my question is, why put in so much extra effort as a designer to do all this?
I want to be absolutely crystal clear about this is exactly what's happening. So I make it a point to say, hey, here's what we're doing. Here are the different states for it. Here's different variations of what can possibly happen. Here are the interactions on click, on hover.
Howdy and welcome to Deep Dive. This is your host, Jay. I'm super stoked that all of you are watching because today with us we have Tammy. Tammy is going to show us how things happen behind the scenes at Figma. Tammy, super stoked to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I am looking at your file structure and pages seem to be very organized. Of course, you being at Figma, you have access to the latest UI 3. So walk me through it. So how do you go about structuring your Figma file?
So for me specifically, my Figma files are pretty organized just because that's the way that my brain tends to work. And I like to order it from top to bottom and to think is the most important for somebody who's landing on my file to see for the first time. So when I'm starting off at the very beginning of a project, I will have things sectioned out. So I have a page where I will call it a crit or check-ins or a section for exploration. And then I will create new pages as they come up. So I tend to have a couple of different sections always. I have a page for my cover that's at the very end. And then this is where all my graveyard random stuff that I'm not really sure about, just throw there at the end. Then I tend to have a section for exploration where I will usually divide up my different rounds of working into different pages, just so like I have a way of referring back to it as I need to. From there, I will then on top of that have reviews, whether that be crits, check-ins, product alignment, whatever, and I'll order that by date and what the type of that is. And then on top of that, I usually will have, whether it be context or it will be like to-dos or timelines, stuff like that seems really important. That will go on top. And at the very top, when a project is complete or like I'm ready to hand off, the very first thing somebody will see is usually the end spec. And this is where I will usually document my work in terms of this is what we're doing. This is what it was before. Here's what we're planning on doing.
Can you zoom in?
And then, yes. So for if I'm doing for the end spec itself, I might have, hey, this is the version that we are trying to build. Here's an overview of what we're trying to do. And then from here, for this design specifically, I was working out the web and the mobile versions. And then for that, I just literally went through my end spec where I talked about here are an overview of what we're trying to do. I have some instances like the main components that I've created that are now built and like ready for dev that people can see.
But quick
our
question
engineers
here.
can see.
This is like almost like you have a presentation that the engineer can walk, like literally get in this Figma file, maybe not have much context, but you literally have overview, you have a table of contents, you're describing what the updates are. So my question is, why put in so much extra effort as a designer to do all this? Why not just give them like, this is the file, the go to dev mode and figure it out?
So for me, it's not just about being able to show here is what you're building. It's also about like why we're building it and being very explicit about it. I think it can be really easy to get lost in translation about what's supposed to happen between different screens or different transitions. And I want to be absolutely crystal clear about this is exactly what's happening. So I make it a point to say, hey, here's what we're doing. Here are the different states for it. Here's different variations of what can possibly happen. Here are the interactions on click, on hover. And then something special that I tend to do is like dev mode can give you the spacings. They can tell you all that stuff. But sometimes it can be really easy to miss certain unique spacing requirements. And so I will call those out specifically. So, hey, we know we use like 4x4, like 4, 8, 12, whatever spacing. But in some instances, I will explicitly say, hey, this spot right here, it should be 2 pixels and this is 16, but this should be 24, just to have that like balance or things that otherwise isn't clear right away. I also make it clear about certain like content additions if I need to, or edge cases, like what happens if things are going over or there's long text or short text, localization stuff, as well as empty states, like what happens if nothing is there or happens if there's error states. This project specifically was special because it's just, we had to go through all of our notifications. And so for that, I was very specific about, hey, this is the exact notification and here's how it should look. And just making sure that they had access to, they shouldn't have to worry about, am I doing this correctly? Like all the information you need about this is going to be here. And I find that having it be like this makes it so that even if it's not an engineer, if it's somebody who's just happening on my file, can see it and then say, okay, this is good. And I understand this. That being said, the other thing that I like to do is continue to build on that dev. So after we maybe got something on staging and people were trying out and then people give me feedback, I will then append a page and say, hey, we're updating that to this, and this is the new version. And this is with the date. This is the new eng spec that you should be focused on.
And then you also call
helps.
out the updates, what you did in the new version.
Yes. And just making it very clear, being like, this is now keeping the old stuff just so that in case people need to see it or there's context, but then what's new and what's changing on top. So everyone has the most context up to speed.
Your engineers must love working with you. Like this amount of like laid out. I feel like after this way of presenting everything in the file, the way you have done, I don't think an engineer will ever have a question like, oh, this is missing or what the error states like. They pretty much have everything.
That's my goal. I want to make their life easier because I find that it results in the most effective or like the most accurate. And so just making sure that if I can give them everything they need to get the thing done correctly or like up to spec, then I can do that. And so for me, that includes whether that be code or like specific strings or stuff like that, to be able to literally say, hey, in code, these are the things that we're targeting specifically, and there's no question about what is being changed.
Oh my God, this is insane. Wow. Yeah, the level of detail, like even you're calling out in code, literally the string characters and stuff that's changing. Oh my God.
Yeah, that just made it easier for me just to be like, hey, what I found specifically with this project was because there's so many different variations of the different types of notifications. It was hard to communicate exactly what was happening and how like text was changing, what copy was changing, or what icons were being used. And I found this made it a lot easier to group them together. And engineers knew, okay, these to this maps to that. They didn't have to worry about it. I did all that work for them.
Do you feel that because of this, you're buying back your time as a designer? Because I've worked in companies where the usual go-to way is the developer pings the designer and then they just get on a call, and what you have in documentation is usually discussed over the call. So
yeah.
Do you feel like this reduced the number of meetings you have to have?
Definitely, but I also tend to talk to my developers along the way and just keep them up to speed as I'm working on it. And so I did also have a meeting where whether that be like an eng handoff meeting, where I said, hey, this is how I've laid it out. Here's what you can expect and how you can read this file. Because it's one thing to build something like this, but it's another thing to expect somebody to understand how to parse it. So I just made sure that I built this, but I also had that call to be like, hey, here's what you can expect. Here's how this thing is broken down. Do you think there's anything missing? Is there anything I can add to this to make your life easier? And then if they have any thoughts, they leave comments, concerns, etc. But it definitely reduced how much conversation we would have to have.
What do you do with the time that you saved? So let's say you saved, 3 meetings that because of the way you've laid out everything. What are you going to do with all this time that you saved?
Go for a walk, maybe. Think about my life. Think about what decisions I made that got me here.
I like that.
Work on other projects.
So I see that you also have this context page. So what's in the context page then?
The context page is what I like to call like all the information about why we're doing this. And so this is something that if somebody were to come here and say, why are we doing this? It's just a deck that says, here's the problem and like why this is a problem, what we're doing, and then walking through just like For this specifically, what we want to do, I'd made a deck about, I ended up actually auditing the notifications. We found that it was like, we didn't have a lot of design files that had all the notifications in one place. So I had to parse through everything that was not only in Figma, but I was lucky enough to get access to our internal GitHub and then actually went through the code base to look and hunt down all of our like notifications, what style, what type they were. And I used that to understand what that problem is. And based on that, talk about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and then what our goal is with this, just so that anybody who's coming on here, they can just see that.
Oh, wow.
Understand where this is coming from.
That makes so much sense because there's so many meetings that are usually spent trying to talk to different stakeholders, explaining what's the business value, what problem you're solving, and you already have that here.
Yeah. And so part of this is something that I had ripped out from like a review that we had. And so usually we'll present like, here is what we're building. Here's why we're building it. And so that deck was something I'd made anyways. And so I ripped it out and put it on the context for other people to see if they need it as well.
Wow. Okay. So the reviews is basically that page is more of like you use for presenting internally to people.
Yeah. So I will present to like leaders and say, here's the project, here's what we're building, here's why we're building, and here are the end result. Like here is what we're going to be shipping. And so because we're giving them that context anyway, it's good to have that upfront as well.
Every single page that you have, I want to get to the bottom of it. I want to figure out like what's going on there because it's such a well thought out process. Yeah. There's another page that I saw. It was called check-in. And I was like, wait, what is a check-in?
Yeah. For me, at Figma, our core team will sometimes have meetings where we're just discussing just the project itself. And for me, a check-in at this time was like, hey, I'm trying to think about this thing that I worked on. This is just me telling them, here are the things that I've been working on in the last week. Here's where I am unsure. Here's like my brain dump of here's where I think I am right now. And this is something that I would have with my PM and other engineers or other designers, whoever is going to be on the call. I'll just be like, here's what I'm unsure about. And here is where I will chat with them about it. The check-in is what I like to call my core team who's working on this specific project. And that's different from crit is usually with our designers themselves. And here I have to worry less about context and context setting because everybody on the team knows what we're talking about. And here is I can be way less put together, I have to worry less about the storytelling. And it's just a lot more random and just plopped in because they know, and then they can iterate with me and jump in the file.
You also have pros and cons for each one of them, it seems like. I like that.
Yeah. This is something that's important it's something that we have in almost every single one of our presentations or like our crits. Is just, for example, this is a crit that I did basically with all the designers across Figma. And here you can also see that I have that context that I told you about. And it's really important here specifically because this team was like, not everybody knows what project we're working on. They're like the far reaches of Figma. And so I made sure to be very explicit about here's what the problem is. Here's what we're doing. Here's the kind of feedback I'm looking for just to make sure that, hey, I'm not ready for details.
Well, let's pause there for a second. Just that screen right there. Okay. Yes. So this is very important. So you're literally telling all the designers across Figma what the project is, but then you're saying this is the level. You have the thumbs up like it's in a concept stage. And you explicitly called out like not looking for visual design or interaction feedback yet.
Yes. Just so that people know that if you see any weird floaty icons, that's not intentional. It's just I'm very much focused on information architecture, information hierarchy, information parsability right now. And all of your feedback should be geared towards that. And that helps. I was able to use that to like not only structure the rest of this of saying, here's what's important, and walking them through some of the problems of the notification structure, but using that as a way to tell a story about, since we're focusing on the information architecture, let's blur out all the other stuff and just focus on what that looks like. Just literally focus on that. And then going back to your point, you can see I have pros and cons. I think having these pros and cons helps the other designers also get a better understanding of like what your thought process is. They can help evaluate that with you. They can also see that like any of the feedback that they have, if they see it in the pros and cons, they know that you've already thought about it. And so it can also help reduce some of that. Like,
have you thought about this
extra feedback?
iteration? Yeah.
Yeah. And then you're like, here's why it didn't work. Yeah. So that's how I went about it. One of the things that I did do as part of this is give them a framework for how I wanted to evaluate it. So what do we want to achieve? I want this to be a maintainable system and structure. I want information to be easy to parse, and the layout should feel simple, clean. And so that is, I said, based on all the stuff that we've been working on, here are the principles that we're going to be going through. And I use that to explain, hey, does this iteration hit those goals that we're talking about? Sure, it's a maintainable system, but information is not easy to parse. So this doesn't feel right. And then I use that to talk about how I think about these problems. And I find like everything that I'm talking to you about here is more about like storytelling and less about the actual crit itself, because I understand the audience that we're designing for or presenting for may not always have the exact context. And so you need to be able to explain to them, hey, here's what we're trying to do, and here's why I think it's not going to get there, or it is getting there. What do you think? Give me your thoughts about that.
And when you want feedback from them, all the designers from Figma, do they leave feedback as comments here, or there's like a separate page where you collect all that feedback?
Yep, it's in comments. Usually at Figma, we have something called silent crit, where as I am talking or as I'm presenting, people will leave comments, and then I'll give people 5-10 minutes to wrap up, ask questions, or leave comments as they need to. And then I will go through the comments and then bring up interesting points or talk about, oh, that's an interesting idea. Tell me more about that. We also do a lot of riffing. If something I've designed feels interesting, or they're like, oh, that's actually cool, they'll pull it out of my file and then start making their own versions. Kelly made a riff here, Rye made a riff here, just playing around with it and leaving potential ideas or thoughts that I can take from my crit and then continue exploring more with it.
And the riff happens live during the crit, or is it something that happens after?
Yeah. Most of the time it happens live. Yeah, they'll like literally pull something out and start playing around with it. Sometimes people have ideas afterwards and they'll plop it in, but it'll usually happen live.
And what's the benefit of a silent crit? Usually the crits that I've been part of, whoever they just raise their hand or just start talking. So what's the benefit by having a silent crit?
I think the silent crit helps people who feel more introverted feel like they have a chance to actually say things without feeling like they have to. It also, I think, reduces the loudest voice in the room issue, where if one person is generally more extroverted, they might say a lot and the ideas of the other people might not be as vocalized. Silent crit helps even that out. And so everybody's comments are equalized, but also it allows everybody to preserve the comments there. So like I can go back to it. It's a lot easier than me like actively trying to take notes when everyone's giving me feedback. And also because everyone else can see each other's comments, you get a lot of people who are like +1 or like thumbs up or whatever. And you know that this specific comment is actually really valuable or really important or like really whatever. And it helps keep everybody like in sync that way. And then you have a nice little artifact to take home and parse through.
How do you deal with the comments? Do you keep them here? Do you mark them resolved?
I think every designer has a different way of working. Typically, what I will do when people leave comments is I'll usually try to respond to their comments. I find it respectful and nice. And if people take time to leave comments, I'll respond to them. But then I'll personally use it as a checklist. As I go through and address some of the concerns and thoughts, I feel like, oh yeah, my next iteration, this is something I've already solved or fixed, I'll resolve it. And then any comments that I want to preserve, I'll just keep it there.
Love it. And then as I'm looking at your pages, I see explorations. I'm just looking to see what else you've got going on. Okay, rounds. All right, okay. Each.
Yeah. So I am incredibly careful about how I do storytelling and presentation for these kinds of pieces. Everything in the top is very highly curated and crafted because I have to be very careful with how I present this, what kind of story I tell, because it's going to dictate what kind of feedback I get. And so it's really important that the storytelling of how I present this during crit is well documented, explained, so that the conversations don't get derailed or that I'm getting exactly what I'm hoping to get. However, explorations is entirely like my space to kind of do stuff. And so it's just a bunch of random things that I just keep playing around with. It's just like every time I have a cool idea, I'll try something new and I'll make a new iteration or make a new version and I'll keep like playing around with it. And each version, each round is either each day that I'm working, or it could also be after a crit has happened. I'm like, okay, that was round 2. Now I'm going to try round 3 based on the feedback that people gave me. Or round 4, like it's just, there's less structure to it. It's a lot less like clear. And then from there, I'll start doing, I just throw stuff at this, and I'm not worried about its like readability because it's not for them. Yeah. Like, for example, the audit, when I mentioned that I did the audit, I'm going through all the design files and going through all of the code pieces. It was really important to me to put that somewhere. And so I just threw that in here and tried to organize them and go as easy of a way as possible. And then just like I have other pages of just like random stuff that I would throw here. I have a prototype that I made that I threw here as well with just like different, and just this is all just random garbage that I would just like throw and be like, I don't care about this anymore. And you can see it's like kind of messy. It's all over the place with like different iterations and versions of it. There's something that I do sometimes that I think it might just be me, but I have this timeline component that I built. Helps me visualize a project in a spatial way. I know you can do this on your calendar, but I like having it in Figma because I am weird. But
You're a visual person.
Built this. That's a better way of putting it. I'm a visual person. It helps me prioritize and think about like how I want to structure and time things out. For example, when we kick off a project, I'll be like, okay, if we want to maybe get to product review or get to engineering getting by a specific date, then I would like to ideally get to crit by a certain time. And I'll use that as a working backwards to be like, okay, here's how much time I have to do some of these pieces. And seeing it visually and being able to go down day by day helps me personally stay up to speed. And usually I find that if anybody's asking me like, what are you guys working on? What are you doing? Just linking them to this also tends to help a lot. The other thing that might be helpful that I tend to do is after I finished this project, I was going to hand it off to another designer. And so one of the things I did was a to-do page where I'm like, hey, let me fill you in on what has been happening. And so all I did was I just basically brain dumped the state of the current state of the project and where my head was at and like what I was thinking about and what there was left to do so that the next person can take it on. And then not only do they have the context of what was done before, but what we were planning to do in the future or where things are right now.
I like this to-do. I feel like any designer that's about to go on vacation and they got to have some other designer fill in for them, they can just say, hey, I've explained everything to you in the call, but just go to the to-do to get an idea of what's happening next.
Exactly.
This is amazing.
Exactly. Yeah. Just like some of my files don't even have anything in it. So like this page says round 1 and apparently I didn't put anything in it. This section is it's a free for all. You'll maybe find something, maybe you won't.
Hey folks, this is Jay. It means the world to me that you watch this video. Let me know in the comments what topics you want me to cover in the future, and I will see you in the next deep dive.